Welcome to the Securing Bitcoin track. Unlike traditional assets, Bitcoin is software running on a decentralized network. This means that its security is predicated on the accuracy and robustness of the software and hardware running it, and the actions of those participating in the network. As the use of Bitcoin grows and as it becomes more deeply embedded into society, the security of the network must grow and strengthen alongside it. This is software. Bugs exist. Some are more serious than others. Moving into the future, strategically supporting the development of Bitcoin will require understanding and proactively addressing its security risks. In this track, we're going to hear from world-class Bitcoin security experts and cryptographers who will be discussing what makes Bitcoin Bitcoin, how upgrades to Bitcoin happen, the merits of Bitcoin's security model, and some of Bitcoin's attack vectors.
Hey, I'm Matt Corallo. I'm an open source engineer with Square Crypto. I've been working on Bitcoin, whether contributing to Bitcoin Core or other projects for a little more than 10 years. And today I'm going to talk about consensus. So what consensus means both from a technical context, a lot of nuance about the technical details of exactly what a consensus system means, and then also how that impacts how we make changes to Bitcoin and how that impacts how people consider the stability of Bitcoin in the long term and what everyone needs to do in order to maintain that stability. You may have heard before that Bitcoin is fundamentally a consensus system. But what this means from a technical lens is that every node, that is every full node and everyone using their full node to accept Bitcoin or interact with the system directly, must agree on the exact current state of the blockchain. So that means everyone needs to have the same exact understanding of who holds which Bitcoin, how much each output is worth, which scripts and which public keys are required to sign to send Bitcoin, and every detail around all of that must be identical across every node. If that's wrong, or if somehow we have a failure of consensus, this means basically that there are two Bitcoins, right? If Bob thinks that Bob has a Bitcoin, but Alice thinks that in fact she holds that Bitcoin, and they both think there's plenty of confirmations on both, then we don't have a single Bitcoin currency, but we have multiple currencies. And so somehow we have to have every node agree on everything. So the magic of this that really allowed Bitcoin to exist was the proof of work. So the proof of work is this great thing that allows us to come to agreement by creating a block once every 10 minutes, and we rate limit the block creation so that it's roughly once every 10 minutes, but it's also random. So a different miner finds a different block at a different time, and we can always see who found the first block, and miners are incentivized to try to continue building on that, and then we end up with this nice linear history of blocks, and we can all agree on the ordering of transactions, and we can all agree on who holds which Bitcoin. Of course, this only actually works if the rules of the system, so the rules which define whether a block is valid or invalid, whether a signature on a transaction is valid or invalid, whether a proof of work meets the correct target, and tons of other rules are enforced identically across every single node in the network. So this means that if Alice, for some reason, her software decides that a block is invalid, but Bob's software accepts the block, then again, we have an irreconcilable difference on the current state of the ledger, and thus, again, two different Bitcoins. This turns out to be an incredibly challenging computer science problem. This is a somewhat new requirement in terms of computer science. It's not something we've had in past distributed consensus systems, where instead of simply forming agreement with some majority of nodes or assuming that nodes are going to only generate certain messages, we can't assume anything. In fact, miners might be malicious. Some small hash power miner might decide that if they can create two Bitcoins, if they can cause this kind of fork, then they can make substantial money, right? They can convince someone that they have Bitcoins when they don't have Bitcoins, or any number of other attacks. And so as a result, the software can't just be good, but must be perfect, and that everyone must have identical software, or at least software that implements the consensus rules, which is the rules as to whether or not a block is invalid, uh, correctly and identically. Today, that basically means everyone runs Bitcoin Core. In practice, it seems fairly likely that it's not really all that practical to ever have more than one implementation of the consensus rules. We've seen this in other cryptocurrencies where you'll have two implementations, and the majority, maybe 60, 70, 80% of people will run one implementation that's faster and better and whatever. And those who run the other one will eventually, occasionally, randomly just get forked off. And if they were using that node actively to accept payment and deciding whether a payment is valid on the basis of that node, then they might have lost money. They might have had a double spend. They might have, again, been told that they had money when, in fact, they did not. Ultimately, the consensus rules, this set of rules, which is enforced by every node 24/7, 365, is what defines Bitcoin. It is what determines the 21 million coins limit. It's what determines the issuance schedule of those coins. It's what determines the feature set for transactions and when they can move money around. And ultimately, all of these decisions have long-range impacts on the way people can or cannot use Bitcoin. Thus, it's also very important that changes to the consensus rules stay consistent with what people view as Bitcoin and what people view as the principles behind how Bitcoin can or should operate. But what if we want to change the rules, right? So how do we do this when we said that every node in the network must in fact enforce the exact same rules at the exact same time, all the time, with no downtime and no changes? How do we in fact upgrade Bitcoin and add new features or whatever we want to change? So this is actually a relatively difficult problem. There's kind of two general solutions. So the first one you can do is wait. So if we kind of start by assuming that everyone has already agreed to a change, right? So we start by, probably incorrectly, but we'll talk about that in a minute. We start by assuming that everyone says, yes, this change is good, we're good to go, let's do it. We still have nodes that are going to update at different times. We still have, someone might forget to update a node for many months, and we don't want them to lose funds as a result of an update that maybe they even were aware of, but they just kind of accidentally forgot for a little bit of time. So if we wait long enough, right, so if we say, all right, we're going to ship this new consensus change, this change to the definition of Bitcoin, and we're going to include it in a release of Bitcoin Core, everyone's going to run it, but it's not going to actually activate. We're not going to have the new change be the definition of Bitcoin until sometime maybe a year from now or maybe 3 years from now, but more than enough time for everyone to have upgraded. Then we can safely roll out changes without having a sudden breakage of the network. Of course, that kind of sucks, because then anytime we want to make a change to Bitcoin, it takes 3 years, 2 years, whatever. Either way, we certainly can't make changes within reasonable time frame, especially after it might have already taken a year or two in order to write the software, test the software, plan all of the design details, etc. So the other and more commonly used approach is what's called soft forks. And so again, like we used proof of work to solve the problem of agreeing on the transaction ordering, we also can use proof of work as a little bit of a cheat in order to deploy changes to the network, aka forks. If we say that 95 or 100% of hash power or some other large amount is upgraded and enforcing the new rules, even if not all nodes are, but many nodes are, then we can use hash power to bridge the gap and say that no transactions that are invalid according to the new rules are going to be mined because, or if they are, they will be quickly reorganized out, then because 95 or some large percentage of the hash rate is enforcing these rules. This is great. Of course, we can't consider these rule changes active and complete at this point, because if it's only hash power enforcing rules, well, that's today's hash power. If someone else comes along tomorrow with hash power, that these rules could change, and we certainly don't want to ever store funds in a new set of rule changes, which tomorrow's hash power could simply decide to not enforce. So we still need to wait for nodes to upgrade and be actively enforcing en masse before we use some new rule set, but we can use proof of work to kind of bridge the gap and allow us to deploy changes more quickly without waiting on every node to be upgraded. Of course, now you get to the obvious problem of how do you know what people are running? Because everyone needs to be running the same rules at the same time, it's fairly easy if we never change the rule set, because you just run the same rules that everyone's been running since day one. But as we deploy new changes with SegWit, with Taproot, with other rule changes, you still need to have very high level of confidence that you are enforcing the exact same set of rules as everyone else in the network. Today, there's not a great solution to that. The solution is kind of, well, you just trust that everyone's running the latest version of Bitcoin Core. Of course, if we were going to always trust that everyone's simply running the latest version of Bitcoin Core, we might as well have the Bitcoin Core developers run a bank, and we don't really have a great need for Bitcoin. Luckily, there's a lot of diverse people within Bitcoin Core with diverse sets of views, contributing, and even more diverse set of people monitoring what Bitcoin Core developers do, allowing for the ability for the community to respond if Bitcoin Core were to do something that's maybe not in the best interest of most members of the Bitcoin community. But this is something that could definitely be improved upon. Large economic actors, large Bitcoin holders, large exchanges, large payment processors which accept or deal with Bitcoin could, and likely should, state publicly what version of the consensus rules they're running, aka exactly which set of software, which release of Bitcoin Core or a fork of Bitcoin Core or what have you, they're using to validate the rules of the Bitcoin network. This isn't a suggestion that large economic actors should declare support or support against. This isn't a suggestion that large economic actors should declare support for or declare that they are against some set of changes to the Bitcoin rules. Ultimately, they alone don't get to decide. But even a passive voice of stating, this is the version we're currently running, might very well be very helpful for ensuring that the community stays in consensus as Bitcoin continues to grow, as potentially more different software exists in the network, and people use different things to enforce the rules. I mentioned at the beginning that we have to kind of assume that everyone's ready to go with a fork by the time we start moving on to the activation phase. Of course, things aren't so simple. How do we, in some way, as a community of Bitcoin users, as large entities using Bitcoin, and as individuals holding Bitcoin or using Bitcoin, agree on a set of changes to, again, the rules which ultimately define what Bitcoin is? It's not an easy problem, and sadly, there's not an easy solution. Obviously, there's some kind of core principles which we all generally buy into. Hopefully, if you're a user of Bitcoin, that there's 21 million coins and it's going to be issued at a certain schedule. That if you store your funds on the blockchain, that the public keys that need to generate a signature for moving those funds generate the signature before those funds can be moved. All these kinds of standard things. Also, something like censorship resistance, that people can get their transactions on the blockchain no matter what. Whether someone accepts the transaction or not is between those entities, but that your transactions can always get onto the blockchain. Ultimately, of course, all of these principles are only true if economic actors, those who transact in Bitcoin, enforce that those principles remain true as consensus rules change. There's only guiding principles. Any of these things could change, but in order for anything to change in Bitcoin, we basically all have to agree that these new set of rules that have been proposed and that are being activated are the new Bitcoin. Because there's always the old Bitcoin, there's always that old system with those old rules that continues to, or could continue to exist. But if we basically all agree that some set of rules is good and certainly is a positive for some people and not a negative for anyone, then we should simply all agree that that new system is simply Bitcoin, ignoring the old system and letting it basically fall by the wayside. This is largely a differentiator and sets Bitcoin apart from nearly every other cryptocurrency, where the community of Bitcoin users is very active and takes a very active role in the set of changes. And as changes get deployed and as changes get proposed and implemented in Bitcoin, the community very actively considers those changes and has a very strong voice in either accepting them or rejecting them. This compared to most other cryptocurrencies where the community has, for no technical difference, but for purely social difference, stated largely that, if the developers, 5, 10, whatever people get together and say that a certain change is going to be made, the community simply accepts it. And that as the new version of the software that powers those networks is deployed, people simply automatically update to that new software instead of having any consideration or any strong voice from largely the rest of the community. This makes these other projects fairly centralized in comparison to Bitcoin, and really Bitcoin is just the one cryptocurrency that has that strong social consensus and that strong culture of carefully considering changes as they happen. Of course, this culture and this property of Bitcoin, all of these important properties of Bitcoin, only remain true as long as the culture remains true, that the community carefully weighs not just the changes as they are directly stated, but also the impact they will have on things like censorship resistance. I mentioned censorship resistance as a core principle, but it's, of course, not a consensus rule itself. You can't require that miners include every transaction that exists. There is no way because of general relativity, in fact, there is no way. You can't require that censorship resistance remains in effect. There is no way, because of relativity, for you to require that miners include every transaction that exists in their blocks. Instead, we can only consider the impact, the indirect impact that changes to Bitcoin will have on the censorship resistance property. If we all believe that Bitcoin is fairly censorship resistant today, we should not make changes that might impact the ability of, for example, miners to run a full node, small scale miners to exist. Even if they don't have a lot of hash power, they might still be able to mine an otherwise censored transaction once a day, which can have very important impacts. All possible properties of Bitcoin, whether it's the issuance schedule or the requirement that signatures exist, could be changed in a fork. Of course, this again requires that every single Bitcoin user agrees that this new system is Bitcoin. And so this gives largely every single Bitcoin user a very strong voice in the upgrade process of Bitcoin, because a very small minority of Bitcoin users could simply say, no, that new proposed change is not Bitcoin, or is not, in my view, Bitcoin, and I will simply stick with the existing network. And this would cause, to some extent, havoc, but also would create two networks and force everyone to decide which one they should call Bitcoin. While this sounds somewhat like the Wild West and a little bit scary and kind of who knows what could happen, there's some really good history around how Bitcoin has evolved over time that gives, hopefully, really positive view on how these kinds of upgrades can happen in the future, and gives us a lot of confidence that changes won't in the future be made without very strong consensus among a large group of Bitcoin users. So the best case study is, in fact, a number of forks, a number of proposed forks, and ultimately one fork that did activate around the block size increase. So for many years, the Bitcoin block size was fixed at 1 megabyte. And this led to many, many years of fighting over the block size within the Bitcoin community. A number of largely businesses, which were worried about their ability to scale their business, were worried about the Bitcoin block size and wanted it to be increased. At times wanted it to be increased rather significantly, and more often than not wanted it to be increased in often a rather naive way. Now, for a long time, these different interests who wanted this increase would sign letters indicating that, this new version of Bitcoin, whether it was Bitcoin Unlimited or Bitcoin Classic or Bitcoin, there were many of them, is now going to be Bitcoin, and they're all going to switch to running that, and that is going to be what they call Bitcoin, and either people take it or they leave it, but that's Bitcoin. Time and time again, however, and in fact, none of these ever actually activated. So while people can sign letters all day long, there was a real concern among all of these folks that if they were to split off and they're not in the supermajority, then they would at least harm Bitcoin, but more likely just kind of be on their own little fork and be running something that is, according to the rest of the world, not Bitcoin, right? Because the network effect of the Bitcoin community is incredibly powerful. And if you're talking about losing either a large number of users, a large number of people holding Bitcoin, a large number of exchanges, a large number of businesses, a large number of miners, whatever it is, if you're talking about losing a large portion of the community, you might in fact lose a lot of the value of Bitcoin. And that a split that has material size on both sides of the split, that where you have Bitcoin 1 and Bitcoin 2, and they're both fairly large, might damage the value, whether from network effects or whether from loss of confidence or what have you. And so no one was really quite willing to commit entirely to going their own way and running some alternative set of consensus rules, and thus nothing ever really came of it for a number of years. Eventually, a proposal was made called SegWit, which was a much less naive increase in the block size, basically, a significant, but not nearly as much as others were seeking, increase in the block size, almost doubling. And while largely most people were fine with it, there wasn't a lot of disagreement about SegWit itself, there was a lot of disagreement about whether SegWit was enough, right? That a lot of people wanted significantly more, and so basically the take was that SegWit by itself was not good because it simply was not enough. Eventually, this led to an attempt at compromise called SegWit 2x. So SegWit 2x was a proposal that proposed both the SegWit soft fork, which could be deployed using just hash power to bridge the gap between upgrading between old nodes and new nodes, and then additionally a hard fork, which would require waiting longer because you wouldn't be able to bridge the gap using just hash power. There were ongoing fights over SegWit 2x, but it did again have signatories signing a letter saying, we're going to call this new thing Bitcoin, of basically every significant business in the Bitcoin community, as well as most of the miners in the Bitcoin community. But what it didn't have is it didn't have a lot of users. And ultimately, the markets were allowed to express their view. Several exchanges offered, either directly or indirectly, a futures market for basically deciding that you want to get tokens on the SegWit 2x Bitcoin or the original Bitcoin, and you could buy one or the other, but you wouldn't get the other one. And the market expressed its view rather clearly and stated that it didn't want SegWit 2x coins. It wanted original Bitcoin. And so as a result, there was significant loss in confidence for this thing. And in spite of the initial very significant support, what ended up happening was a further compromise where both the far to one direction supporters of block size increases who supported SegWit 2x, as well as those far to the other end of the political spectrum within Bitcoin who didn't support that and wanted kind of the opposite of that, were allowed to both basically claim they won, but ultimately the resolution being that only the minimum agreeable subset, the thing that everyone largely agreed on and not the other pieces, was activated in the form of SegWit, and not the later proposed hard fork or any other changes that had been proposed. So while there was lots of political machinations at the time, this very, very strong desire to not split Bitcoin and to have only one asset at the end of the day was so strong that Bitcoin won. That the only thing that activated was the thing that no one really disagreed with and helped some people, maybe didn't help others, but the other things that some people really strongly disagreed with and some people really strongly agreed with didn't happen. This is really good for Bitcoin in the sense that Bitcoin exists to be this very stable system that exists and isn't going to change out from under you, that you can have some level of confidence that the properties it has today are going to be the properties it has for some time into the future. And while it might get changes and might get upgrades in the future, that those fundamental properties that hopefully most users of Bitcoin, most large transactors of Bitcoin find as important, they will continue to enforce, and that these will be the properties that Bitcoin has for a long time, in spite of the somewhat messy and complicated and undefined process for changes to Bitcoin. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's up to you to prevent bad forks. It's up to all of the large transactors in Bitcoin, the large users of Bitcoin, the institutions holding Bitcoin who care about the properties that it has, that it interested them in buying in the first place, to take a stand against forks when they don't make sense, and to remain neutral on forks or be positive on forks, but refuse to run any changes to the consensus rules or agree to any changes of the consensus rules until they have absolute confidence that the vast majority of Bitcoin users and transactors is in the same boat as them. That any chance of splitting is a worse outcome than any possible changes that could happen. Of course, there's lots and lots and lots of dubious claims around Bitcoin and cryptocurrency communities on the internet. Even many of the mainstream, quote unquote, publications within the cryptocurrency community are of dubious technical quality sometimes. So at the end of the day, it's up to you to hire a Bitcoin protocol engineer, fund a Bitcoin protocol engineer, or at least ask a Bitcoin protocol engineer, find someone who contributes to Bitcoin Core, ask them what the details are of different proposed forks, ask them what the trade-offs are. People generally are very responsive, and there's a lot of folks who contribute to Bitcoin Core with very different views, allowing a lot of different takes. Urgency when someone shows up and says that some change needs to happen immediately is probably a good sign that that change shouldn't happen at all. There's been many times where changes have been proposed, where people have been very committed to them, and advocates for the change have indicated that they think it's ready and that it needs to happen immediately to solve some perceived problem with Bitcoin, some perceived fundamental problem with Bitcoin. And time again, we found that they just didn't make sense. And had we deployed them, it would have been a very serious problem. So thank you for your time today, and I hope you will prevent bad forks.
Hello, it's my pleasure to speak with Adam Back, the co-founder and CEO of Blockstream. Adam is a seminal figure in the Bitcoin community. His work on proof of work was cited in the Bitcoin white paper. He's the inventor of Hashcash and a noted cryptographer that's been part of the cypherpunk community for decades. Adam, it's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Yeah, likewise, pleasure to be on.
So I wanted to dive right into it. Obviously, there's this ongoing debate about the cost or externalities associated with proof of work and the alternative systems that could potentially be embraced. What to you is the significance and purpose of proof of work in Bitcoin? Kind of the primary purpose of it.
So it's very interesting when you come at Bitcoin afresh to try to understand all the different things proof of work is doing. So clearly it's providing a decentralized way for people to acquire new coins by mining them. And so, if you look at alternative systems where there's a central issuer that sort of pre-mines or creates all the coins with zero cost, then there's a political dynamic where they're handing them out. So Bitcoin provides a sort of geopolitical neutrality, no central party. It's also part of what makes Bitcoin permissionless, that anybody can mine and they can mine anonymously. And I think that's an important factor for Bitcoin because it keeps, kind of policy aspects out of the protocol. Bitcoin's trying to be cash settled bearer because transaction disputes add cost to, the legacy fiat payment rails. So Bitcoin, by being cash settled, takes that out of the base layer. And then, of course, the miners are also a kind of tiebreaker there's a kind of tie breaking with a race condition between different people mining at the same time, potentially. And the other thing the miners are doing is ordering the transactions. So in particular, there's actually very little trust placed in miners, because almost every major economic player in the system, power users, exchanges, wallets, etc., are verifying everything for themselves. And so miners, they could mine something incorrect and it wouldn't really cause a problem. And also miners have very little governance control of their service providers in effect. So, their opinions about protocols or about block sizes, going back to the 2015 discussions, don't really weigh that heavily in the network. And the number of those things turn out to be relatively subtle and non-obvious at first glance.
Some people like to characterize mining as, providing security for the Bitcoin system. I think the message I'm getting from you is that it's slightly more nuanced than that, and that miners are just one kind of set of stakeholders, and they provide, this pretty ultimately limited service of transaction ordering and converging to, a single unified history of transactions. How do you think about this notion of mining securing Bitcoin? Is that the way that you describe it?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a key part as well, which I didn't talk about there, which is the providing the finality. So, and some kind of economic incentive. So I think you see that with other commodity money, like physical gold and things like that, that it's a system that works because money has a cost. I think money that doesn't have a cost ultimately ends up being political in nature. So people closer to the money, so-called Cantillon effect, are going to be advantaged. People with the purse strings to create more money have enormous political power. And ultimately, as with the Genesis block quote about the Chancellor of the Bank of England printing lots more money, you end up with the sort of conflict of interest situation where you get this so-called moral hazard, where central banks have monetary policy committees and policies, but when the going gets rough, they cave to political expediency, and invariably that actually is more painful and more expensive in the long term, leading to kind of inflationary periods in currencies that are hard to depend on.
So speaking of central banks, I mean, other competitors to Bitcoin or alternative systems like to tout, the merits of stripping proof of work out of the system and instilling a set of validators or other kind of privileged entities that perform a similar function, determine the finality of the ledger and sort of the outcomes in the database. How do you think about this notion of stripping proof of work out of a cryptocurrency and instituting some other validator set? I mean, does that give you the same assurances as Bitcoin gives you?
No, I mean, that basically reinvents the status quo. And I think, an interesting hook to start to pick that apart is an observation by Paul Stortz, which is that there is an economic interest on the part of every economic actor to acquire currency units, namely Bitcoin in this system, or US dollars in a currency system. And so there should logically be a financial incentive equal to that value, the new currency units that come into the market, to obtain it. So, if Bitcoin is producing, so many hundreds of billions of dollars of coins at a given price per month, up to that economic effort will be expended to obtain it. And the same applies to, fiat currencies as well, or proof of stake systems. So in other words, that effort will be expended regardless. That's just a kind of economic reality. And then the question is, but it's disguised. So the question is, well, where does that economic effort go? So, it goes into lobbying favoritism, ultimately wars, over currency control and military expenditure, accounting and audit to deal with double spends and irregularities. So the costs are ultimately borne anyway, and I would say typically in a less efficient and clean way, i.e. one more subject to biases and corruption and political favoritism. So I think Bitcoin has a much cleaner way and avenue for people to express their economic interest to obtain new currency units, which is you can mine or you can buy from others who have mined.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly astute observation that Bitcoin renders transparent the competition associated with obtaining new units of currency and alternative systems where it's not this open free market competition. You still have this economic motive and you simply get availed kind of or obfuscated form of proof of work. When we think about the comparison of Bitcoin and other commodities, Satoshi was very fond of comparing it to gold and gold mining. And Satoshi has this sort of infamous quote about gold mining. Gold mining is a waste, but that waste is far less than the utility of having gold available as a medium of exchange. Do you align with this? I mean, does describing mining as a waste, which is merited due to the qualities of the system, the utility you get from the system, is that kind of your view on this as well?
Well, I mean, it's a way to express the value achieved, right? That you end up with a valuable currency and it only has to be mined once, effectively, right? But I think beyond that, as we were just discussing, that actually that effort will be expended anyway in any monetary system. And I think another interesting people typically miss second order effects because money is hard to think about social construct. And so in particular, any money that is spent on something has to come from somewhere. There has to be an alternative where it would have been spent. And so if you think about the alternative of people who chose to mine Bitcoin or people who chose to buy Bitcoin from miners, what would they have done in the alternative? Let's say in their life before they got involved in Bitcoin or before they chose to invest in Bitcoin. And typically people who invest in Bitcoin start to get more interested in long-term thinking, long-term investment, and kind of a less consumerist behavior. So typically there are many people who have not previously invested or did put less of their disposable income into savings, did more spending. And of course, any spending in today's society involves a lot of short lifespan consumer goods, plastics and things that end up in landfills within a few years. And so that is the alternative, right? So it's likely the case that Bitcoin is actually, already carbon negative because the expenditure that's going into this, Bitcoin units is coming from somewhere, which is the alternative. And, so people are spending. And the other thing is that people look at the point in time cost of mining, but historically, many coins have already been mined and they were mined at far lower prices and so a far lower electrical cost.
Right. Yeah. So the average carbon intensity of a typical unit of Bitcoin has to reflect the historical energy expended to mine when the hash rate and difficulty was lower. And so there was just less energy instantiation. So Blockstream, I think it's well known, engages in mining. How do you think about that as a kind of a US-based firm? How do you think about miners' obligation, if one exists, to be transparent about where their energy derives from? I mean, some would say it's an industry like any other, but also equivalently, there's a huge amount of press coverage and pressure on miners to kind of be more transparent with sort of their energy mix and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, so Blockstream is a Canadian parent corporation, so we have mining in Canada and in the US, and over time in more sites. So we're expanding the number of sites we have. Actually, our energy mix is quite a bit above average. We're over 80% zero emission. And a part of that is from the mining we're doing in the Quebec region of Canada. So that province of Canada has hydropower and other renewables, which comprise 99% of the power makeup. So, and actually, you know, the people, you know, any kind of complicated topic is more nuanced than typical media coverage. So you get sort of unrepresentative or assumptions about things that need to be fixed that are fixed in very wrong ways compared to what the actual issues are. So I think in particular, you know, the amount of power that the entire Bitcoin network uses, maybe something on the order of 10 to 12 gigawatts. And the Quebec province of Canada has more unused power than that, i.e. that single province of one country has more than enough hydropower to power the unused hydropower, I should say. So, you know, they're just opening the sluice gates and letting it heat up the environment because they don't have a use for it. And it's not the only country with this situation, right? So I'd say there's a surplus of green power. In fact, the problem is getting political access to it. So, you know, in Montreal in particular, the power generation company is government owned, and due to an unfortunate set of political events around an election, there arose some confusion, and they placed a moratorium on access to that, you know, 99% green power that's going to waste. And it's actually very difficult to get access to it as a miner. So, you know, we've been expanding in other areas, but there are other areas, you know, into the US particularly at the moment. And you know, there's a good energy mix there as well. So I would just say that it's not a shortage of green power. It's, you know, there's a lot of bureaucracy around power grids. And so people talk about governments incentivizing green power with, you know, carbon credits, or, you know, I think Tesla, for example, gets quite a lot of its revenue from carbon credits. But in practice, you know, there's a green power, and Bitcoin miners are unable to use as much of it as is effectively going to waste. And that also represents, you know, a financial loss to that province, because they could sell that unused capacity for, you know, presumably $1 billion plus a year of revenue to the province.
Right. And the political pressures in China effectively terminating mining in China. At some points in the last couple of years, 50-60% of that Chinese mining operation, which was dominant globally, was based on coal. So you have to imagine that the elimination of that dirtier mining is going to work to the benefit of Canadian, US, Northern European miners, and to the benefit of the sustainability for the network.
Well, I mean, I think there were two discussion topics with China. One is, I think ideally you don't want too much mining in one political zone, because you want just enough, you know, at least enough decentralization so that one regime couldn't influence, you know, impose a policy on transactions that are processed. And actually, lesser known, but the, you know, Blockstream put out a graph from analysis that showed that the proportion of global hash rate in China had actually been decreasing over the last 2 years. So it wasn't just the last kind of recent curtailment. It had already fallen below 50%, you know, in the previous year, by the previous year. And so I think the other thing is, you know, the power makeup in China is mixed. So there is a lot of hydropower in China, which is now, you know, like the Canadian power, being even more underused than it was before, because the miners have been asked to stop. And China has a lot of kind of large infrastructure projects that were built out in advance. So there are kind of, you know, large hydro dams far away from populated areas where there was something planned, but it's not built yet. So that, you know, that is a detraction from the green makeup of Bitcoin mining. But then there are other areas of China that were using coal power, and there's also some seasonality. So they would move miners between regions depending on the flood season, where there'd be more hydropower.
So I think you're really the perfect person to cover a discussion of proof of work, because you're so central in the origins of the notion of proof of work itself. I mean, that's the citation in the Bitcoin white paper is your 2002 paper. And in that paper, you mentioned that you weren't aware of, some people trace the prehistory of this notion of proof of work back to Dworkin Naor, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in 1992. You suggested that you weren't aware of that paper. So if that is the case, how did you yourself come to this idea of using hash collisions to derive a sort of economic cost?
Yeah, I mean, actually, there are some related works going all the way back to the invention of public key cryptography. So one of the first kind of rudimentary public key crypto systems dates back to, I think, 78, and that also involves something like a proof of work, but a sort of expensive decryption. Yeah, I wasn't aware of Dworkin Naor, and actually the Dworkin Naor proof of work is quite different to Hashcash. So there are 3 variants in the paper, and 2 of them certainly are not possible to use for proof of work, and the 3rd is probably impractical or may have shortcuts. So you need a particular set of properties for proof of work. You need it to be sort of have a level playing field effect where one guy with one miner, who comprises 0.001% of the network can get 0.001% of the expected reward, and those other proof of works don't have that property, are much larger, and so on. So, but actually, how I ended up thinking about proof of work was sort of relating to tragedy of the commons kinds of situations on the internet with spam and sort of nuisance denial of service attacks against remailers, which I was an operator of. So it's a way to get privacy for internet discussion forums. And it seemed that people would spam through them. And typically anti-spam systems involve trying to blacklist identities and IP addresses and servers and things like that. But because it was, by design, an anonymous system for having online communications, there's no identity to block by, as a design principle. And so when I was facing this problem along with other remailer operators, it caused me to think about the problem in a different way, because you couldn't do what everybody else was doing. And so I thought about the root of the problem, which is, well, basically there's almost no cost. So what you really want to do is be able to charge for mail, ideally with the recipient receiving the money, so they're compensated in some small way. But that's complicated to do, so you need a whole electronic payment system. So I found a way instead to at least impose a cost, and that in itself changes the economics. Even though the recipient doesn't monetarily benefit, they benefit in the sense of there having been a sort of postage stamp cost imposed on the sender. It means that you get less time wasted on spam, basically. So it's a kind of economic cost mechanism, and of course it's scalable. So you could spend a few seconds on a CPU, and today's Bitcoin mining is vastly more trillions of times more work per stamp or coin or block than was used for the postage stamp scheme back then. Plus, of course, processors have become faster.
So I find the history so fascinating because you describe it in the paper as a kind of a digital postage, metering or imposing this cost on mail. So in theory, the mail you get is more legitimate because it becomes expensive to do spam. You also call it hash cash, and in the paper you also say it could be a possible minting mechanism for Weidai's B money, which was sort of Bitcoin-like system that was proposed back in the day. So you were clearly already thinking about it as potentially being a monetary unit in its own right, even back then. Is that right?
Yeah. So I mean, there's some context, which is there was a lot of interest to see a bearer electronic cash with privacy and bearer properties for the internet, and on the cryptography and particularly the cypherpunks list, that was a kind of central applied R&D question. How could this be achieved? And there'd been a previous system, shortly before Hashcash called DigiCash, and it had it had very good privacy properties, so it was effectively bearer. However, it had a centralized double spend database, and that proved to be its undoing because it was operated by central point of failure, that startup, and it ultimately failed financially. And so I think many people who were interested in this applied research, who want to build and deploy systems, took that as an object lesson and realized that for a system to succeed, it would need to be decentralized. And so, when I published the Hashcash kind of reference code and started discussing, there was some discussions on the cypherpunks list. This was actually before the paper. The paper came 5 years later. So this was in 97. It seemed that multiple people independently made the observation that, the proof of work to create these stamps was somehow like digital gold or digital scarcity. And, that ended up starting a multi-year discussion about how to control inflation in a system like that. Because if you have a mechanism to print money and computers get faster, there needs to be something to automatically govern in a decentralized way, the supply of coins, basically. And so it took until Satoshi to actually finally solve that problem. It's the Bitcoin solution looks elegant in hindsight, but back then nobody quite found a solution. So, the discussions about this topic in 97 and by 98, basically all of the distributed electronic cash systems after that were proposing to use Hashcash for mining, following on from these early discussions. So in 1998, Wei Dai with B-Money proposed using Hashcash, and Nick Szabo with BitGold also, and a 2004 paper 2004 deployed system. Those were just blog posts, articles. But Hal Finney actually built RPAL, reusable proof of work. It was centralized, but it had privacy and some auditability, which was a new twist on the DigiCash system, and Hashcash proof of work to get coins. DigiCash, the original DigiCash system was envisaged to be like a stablecoin. It would work in partnership with a bank, also another bootstrap problem. So Wei Dai had made the comment that one of the advantages of using proof of work to mine the coins is you can have an electronic cash system without an interface to banks.
Yeah, that I mean is the key merit, is creating something of economic value without having to rely on commercial bank dollars or anything like that in originating this value into existence. It is incredible to me that it seems like all the pieces were there conceptually. It just had to be put together in the right way and then paired with this notion of the difficulty adjustment to meter the inflation of the system. I mean, you've had such a special purchase over this development. I've loved the history lesson. When you think about proof of work, I mean, is there any way, could Bitcoin have possibly existed without proof of work, or is it just ultimately completely intrinsic?
I mean, it does seem difficult to have it be as economically aligned and robustly decentralized without that sort of economic force. As we were discussing, the alternative systems tend to be much closer to the fiat system, and it's not clear to me particularly that, a fiat-like system, which is, effectively a federated model with a central party that's created the coins, would necessarily be ultimately better than fiat systems, because fiat systems, they have highly qualified monetary policy experts, where the proof of stake crypto systems, without naming names, are effectively managed by some developers, some company execs or something, mostly with zero prior experience in monetary policy, economics, and so on.
Well, I think we're at time, Adam, but this has been absolutely fascinating. Thanks for the conversation today.
Thank you. It's an interesting conversation always.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the Securing Bitcoin Attack Vectors panel. My name is Neha Narula, and I am the director of the Digital Currency Initiative at MIT. Now I'm going to go ahead and let the panelists introduce themselves, starting with Cory.
Hi, I'm Cory Fields. I work with Neha at the Digital Currency Initiative at MIT. I'm a software developer there.
AJ.
Hey, I'm AJ Anthony Towns. I work on Bitcoin and sometimes Lightning stuff for Paradigm.
And Andrew.
Hey, I'm Andrew Poelstra. I'm the Director of Research for Blockstream out of California.
Great. Thank you guys so much for being here today. So I think a pretty common thing that I hear is, Bitcoin's been around for more than 12 years now and nothing's happened. Everything's going great. It's super secure. We have nothing to worry about. And, basically the system just runs itself. So I think given that this is something that we hear a lot, it'd be pretty fun to talk about reasons why you think that might or might not be true. I certainly don't think it's true. So the way I want to start is with setting some context about security. I'd love it if everyone could kind of share their most interesting historical bug or attack or situation or near miss that's happened with Bitcoin. And this is not just to scare everybody out there, but I think it's really interesting to hear about the things you might not know have happened in Bitcoin's history. So who wants to start? Cory, you had a pretty interesting run-in that maybe wasn't exactly Bitcoin, but maybe you want to talk about that.
Sure. It wasn't Bitcoin, but it was the Bitcoin code base. So it's kind of close. So in 2018, I discovered a bug in Bitcoin Cash, which was it's a currency that was a fork of Bitcoin and like I said, shared most of the same code base. And because so many of these currencies share the same code base, it's useful to audit other code bases as well as Bitcoin's to see if maybe fixes have been discovered or optimizations have gone into those other code bases that the Bitcoin core software can adopt. So in looking for optimizations and fixes, I actually found a bug in Bitcoin Cash, and that bug was one of the something that was potentially exploitable. And this class of bug is called a chain split bug. So what I discovered was that I had the ability to create a transaction, and if I broadcast this transaction to the Bitcoin Cash network, I could effectively fork the Bitcoin Cash network into two parts. So one half of the network would say, this is what the ledger looks like, and the other half of the ledger would say, this is what the ledger looks like. And without some sort of immediate panic and reconciliation, it would just split off into two forever.
Well, Cory, maybe you can explain why that's bad. What does it matter if that happens? Yeah.
So basically, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, the value is that there is a universal shared ledger, and the entire point of Bitcoin, the distributed consensus mechanism, proof of work, all that is to be able to come together to find one ledger, and it moves forward, and because it's a blockchain, everything builds on top of everything that has come before. So essentially, if you have one transaction that makes it into a valid block on one side and one in another side, these two will never reconcile again. So at that point, if you say, what is the value of Bitcoin Cash, or what is the, how do I transact with Bitcoin Cash? You have to be more specific at that point. You have to say, are you on this side or are you on that side? And that's pretty catastrophic because, if you're trying to accept a currency that has split into two, you now have to decide which one you want to take and which one is the real one. And it becomes this huge social problem. So for that reason, this class of bugs, like I said, we call it a chain split bug, has the potential to be one of the most catastrophic in cryptocurrencies like this. But to me, the interesting part of the bug wasn't actually the bug itself. It was the disclosure and how disclosure works. So the problem with finding a bug like this is because I could craft a transaction that would fork the network, anybody else could also. So if I go around saying I discovered this bug and then someone else forks the network, then it looks like I did it. And there's really no recourse there. So I had to be really anonymous and sneaky in the way that gets disclosed. And so that itself was a whole experience in going through the process of this, anonymous disclosure. But at the same time, you have to convey the importance of the thing. So you while you're just this anonymous node on the internet, you also are trying to communicate the fact that this is a really big deal. so that was going through that has actually kind of changed my perspective on Bitcoin a little bit, because it's finding a bug like that and going through it, it makes you realize kind of how brittle and how or at least how possible it is for this to happen in other cryptos as well.
Yeah, I mean, going through that with you was a really interesting, eye-opening experience for me as well. And for anyone who wants to learn more, there's a couple blog posts that Cory wrote about that experience and about security in cryptocurrencies in general. So I certainly learned a lot from that. And, when we're talking about, the really scary part about this bug, I think, is anybody could broadcast a transaction that could do this, right? Anybody in the world. There's no gating mechanism. There's nothing that keeps
Right. There are lots of other classes of bugs that require like a miner to do something or an exchange to do something, or for users to collude in some way. But this was just one person. Just,
you don't even need hash power.
One anonymous person on the internet could just destroy the value of this currency. So yeah, it's really, really scary.
Yeah, definitely. Well, moving on, I want to talk about, we only have so much time, and I want to talk about more fun bugs. Andrew, why don't you tell us about an interesting situation, what you think? Why don't you share yours with us?
Sure. So I've got an oldie, but a goodie. So I'm going to talk about a bug that's actually been arguably is still in Bitcoin. It's been there since the very beginning, since long before any of us were involved. This is known in the Bitcoin space as a SIG-hash single bug. And the way that this works is that when you sign a Bitcoin transaction, you have the ability to specify which parts of the transaction you'd like to cover. And the idea is that any part of the transaction that you cover can't be changed, right? So normally you would just sign the entire transaction saying, I'd like to send this money from me to somebody else. You sign the whole transaction, it goes out there. Nobody can change it because it has a signature on it. That's sort of what a digital signature is it's a way of making something immutable, such that only the person who made the signature can change it, and then only by recreating the signature. So in Bitcoin, sometimes when you're doing multi-party things, you might want to say, like, only sign the inputs of the transaction and only one of the outputs, or sign all of the outputs but not all the inputs. And the idea there might be that somebody else could come along and like add more inputs to the transaction, right? And then maybe you would sign like a partially funded transaction, and somebody else would add more to it. And one of the things that you can specify is basically you can choose to specify one output of the transaction that you want to cover with a signature. You can say, like, I'm trying to send this money to Neha. I'm going to sign the output that goes to Neha. Or I might say, well, I'm just sending the money to anybody, so I'm going to sign my own change output, but then leave all the rest of the outputs untouched or something. And essentially what you do is you say, like, I want to sign the 0th output or the first output or the second or so on. And there's an interesting question that the software has to answer as to what happens when you try to sign the 3rd output, but there aren't 3 outputs, right? And ideally what would happen is that the transaction would just be invalid, right? You aren't allowed to do that. If you do that and try to broadcast it to the network will say, well, this doesn't make sense, so we'll reject it. But in fact, what happens is that due to a quirk in the Bitcoin code base dating back to 2008, I guess, internally, Bitcoin nodes, Bitcoin validators will replace the digest of the transaction to be signed just with the number 1. Just a plain old number 1. It has nothing to do with the transaction. It has nothing to do with anything else. So if you were to sign the number 1 with one of your keys for some reason, anybody could take that signature and use it to steal all of your coins by saying, well, I'm going to take the signature of number 1. I'm going to claim that it's a valid signature on the transaction by exploiting the SIG-hash single bug. And in practice, this isn't an issue. Because nobody would sign the number 1 like that. It's quite difficult. It's not even like the hash of the number 1. It's not like one structured as a proper message. Like, you really have to go like open a computer algebra system and like manipulate signatures by hand to make this happen. But what's especially interesting about this bug, so not only did that slip through, this is already kind of surprising. And if you're a cryptographer, maybe your hair is raising because you see like raw numbers being moved around in place of messages. The scary thing is, this number 1 actually just represents an error code inside of the C++ code base, and sort of the way that C++ was written back in 2008. Often you use raw numbers. And half the times when you're doing this, you use the number 1, and half the time when you're doing this, you use the number 0, and nobody really agrees on which one means error and which one doesn't. And had Satoshi used the number 0, it would not require you to sign the number 1 for anyone to take your coins. As it turns out, the way that the arithmetic of digital signatures work, or the way the arithmetic of ECDSA works, is that anybody can produce a signature of the value 0 with any public key that's laying around. So had Satoshi made like a coin flip in a different direction, then accidentally it would be possible in Bitcoin to spend coins by signing the algebraic value 0, not the message 0, but like just like the number 0. And then you could take any coins out there on the network. And had this been the way that the bug was, well, probably we would have removed the bug by now. So because you have to sign 1, we've actually just left it in Bitcoin. Like to this day, you can still use this if you want to fool around. But had it been the number 0, this potentially would have been very catastrophic. So there's kind of a near miss here due to a very understandable, or at least understandable in 2008 C++ coding error. Sort of crossed several layers of abstraction to then play with the raw algebra that you would see in like an academic crypto paper describing digital signatures that would have led to a catastrophic break where like all the signatures were meaningless. And so this is comparable to a total chain split, I'd say, in terms of catastropheness. So I'm going to stop there and see if AJ can top this.
Yeah. I think, well, we'll talk about how do you even compare these things in terms of how bad they would be. I think that's a super interesting question. And it's really interesting what you're describing, that crosses so many different layers, and that is also still there. It's like, this is a weird thing, but we're just going to leave it there. It's probably better to just leave it there, sort of as evaluating how much harm can be done. So and it also makes you really think about, well, what's going to happen when it's time to upgrade cryptography? I think that's a really challenging question. But AJ, yes, I would love to hear about what is your favorite story.
So my favorite story is from pre-Bitcoin stuff. It was from when I was involved in Debian, which was we had a bug one day that someone found that was the random number generator in the SSH daemon. So the SSH daemon is what you is how you remote administer any computer. So it's meant to be a secure thing. So you use cryptography to connect, and you have a secret public key that you use to authenticate yourself. And so every server needs to generate its own public key that proves that it's the right server, and every user has to generate a public key that will prove that they're them. And a change in the SSH code to hopefully make it more secure was made to include a bit more randomness. But instead of including more randomness, it included just the extra randomness and not all the randomness that they had before. And so it ended up that everyone who was running a Debian system who was generating a key, so any new installs or anyone who wanted to update their own key to access all their servers, was generating one of basically a handful of the exact same keys that everyone else was using. And so for a period of about 2 or 3 years, I think, all the keys that anyone generated on Debian was the same small set, and anyone could just generate all those keys, try them, and access any server that had been set up to access these keys, or fake being any server that had set up being one of these keys. And I avoided hitting that bug because I just don't update my keys often enough, so I missed that period. But the next upgrade was that everyone who's used one of these, there's a little script to check if it's this, and it reports that your system's insecure and that you'd better update as soon as possible. And so that was the maintainer in Debian of SSH doing an update, getting a single line of code wrong, and no one noticing because, hey, it's open source, there's plenty of other eyeballs looking at it, why do I need to look at it? And it's a security hole for every Debian Ubuntu system for a couple of years.
AJ, if you had to describe sort of what is the real world impact of that for someone who's not, maybe isn't using Debian or, isn't running it on their computer, but what would be something that would tangibly affect them as a result of that bug?
So if you're using any software as a service that's running Debian underneath, which is a lot of them, that means that all the data on that server of yours is accessible by anyone with these keys that are meant to be the secure keys that only the admins of the service can get in, but because there's only a few, anyone can guess them. And lots of people have extra security on top, like firewalls and VPNs. And so if they're secure and you can only SSH through a VPN, then you've got the extra layer of protection. But for all the Amazon web servers and stuff that are just direct SSH in, not good.
Yeah, probably a lot of things were affected. But that was very sneaky of you. You didn't mention a bug in Bitcoin, but that's okay. I guess technically I did not make that a requirement of this question. I wouldn't say that this is my favorite by any means, but I do feel like we have to mention the inflation bug of 2018 just because it was kind of crazy. And that was a point in time when this time it wasn't anyone could broadcast a transaction. It's specifically a miner had to mine a transaction. So at least, you had to be capable of mining a block, but so a miner could have mined a transaction that inflated the supply of Bitcoin. It would have been very obvious that this happened, but still it's a little terrifying since part of the goals of Bitcoin are to maintain a certain distribution of funds and a certain cap on all the Bitcoin that will ever happen. So that one was super fun and interesting, I think, just because of the existential crisis of what Bitcoin is, the effect it would have had on that. And I think, I think that sort of leads me to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is, hopefully this hasn't totally scared you, but I think if you're in the audience listening to this, what you should take away is that people in Bitcoin take security very, very seriously. This is very important. And part of the reason for that is because that's kind of the whole point. The whole point is to be able to create this open permissionless system that anyone can join, anyone can access, anyone can transact within, and at the same time protect money, which is pretty challenging to do. So, I think people might all have different ideas about what Bitcoin is and what Bitcoin is for, but certainly, hopefully, you can agree that the whole point is to maintain it as a decentralized system. And I think that probably means that the people who work on Bitcoin and contribute to it have a certain set of priorities when it comes to how they think about security and how they might weigh security against features, for example. So Andrew, let's go to you first. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. What is it that people are trying to balance, and why is it the case that people aren't running around and implementing tons of features in Bitcoin all the time?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I work a lot on Bitcoin and on Bitcoin Core. And my job is more or less to worry about bugs like the one I described, the sig hash single bug, right? Where there are like weird interactions between the code, but ultimately somewhere the logic went wrong. But what my job would be, if I knew how to do it, would be to worry rather about the decentralization of Bitcoin. And that's a very big word. There's a lot to fit into there. And the two aspects that I'll touch on, because I know we don't have several hours to discuss this word. The first is usually what people mean by decentralization, which is roughly that anybody with fairly limited computing resources, with limited CPU time, with limited bandwidth, and so on, is able to join the network and is able to verify the transactions. They're able to get caught up with the current state of the network and continue to move forward. And that's certainly a big priority for everybody in Bitcoin. We really want to make sure that everything's computationally tractable. We really worry a lot about things that would require extra disk space or extra bandwidth or extra CPU time. And often we need to trade off additional capacity for the system against that goal of making sure that it's still accessible, even to people who have a constrained view of the network, whether because they don't have access to good hardware or because they actually have a constraint, like maybe they're working from behind a state firewall, or they're connecting through a satellite system, or they for some reason don't have good access to a lot of data or the ability to process a lot of data. But the second part of decentralization that I worry about more and know less how to deal with is maybe something that I should call legibility, right? And the idea here is that everybody ideally should be able to understand what they're getting into when they work with Bitcoin. They could understand the rules of the system, like ultimately, technically, what's going on when a transaction is being created. They would understand what the rules are like in terms of the supply, how are new Bitcoins issued, how do they move, when they move, what's involved with that. You create digital signatures. Okay, well, what's a digital signature? There are keys, there are secret keys. How do you keep track of these keys? Can you keep that on a hardware wallet? What if you want multiple people to sign off on a transaction? What if you want to do, and all these things we can sort of do in Bitcoin, and it's already kind of a very large system that is difficult to describe. But then what if you wanted to somehow support multiple assets on the system? What if you wanted to have an inflation schedule that was more different? What if you wanted to have different people that So this is tying into the inflation schedule. What if you wanted to have knobs in the system that humans were allowed to manipulate? What would the implication of that be? What if the fee schedule was different? What if the way that here's I'm sort of leading into another thing that we'll circle back to in a few minutes. But what if the way that miners were paid was not by them getting new coins, but by individual transactors choosing to attach a network fee to their transactions? And the theme that I'm getting at here is that right now, to understand Bitcoin, what worries me is that you somehow have to be a computer scientist and a cryptographer and an economist, and nobody is all of those things, right? And I would like for us to move closer to a model where people are able to wrap their heads around this rather than farther away from that. So the goal whenever I try to work on the Bitcoin system, whenever I make changes or propose changes, I try to make sure that everything I'm proposing is somehow simpler in some sense than what went before it, I guess, with the goal that Bitcoin would be legible to people who don't have access to years and decades to turn themselves into certain kinds of specialists.
Yeah, if I could maybe take a stab at summarizing what you said, Bitcoin is already complicated enough. It's hard enough to reason about the way it is, and trying to reason about something with more features would be even more complex. We want to move towards simplicity rather than complexity. Does that kind of summarize a little bit?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, AJ, I know you've been spending a lot of time looking at other cryptocurrencies, in addition to Bitcoin, just kind of as part of what you've been doing. How do you think about sort of what Andrew just raised, and how do you think about the security ethos in Bitcoin? And are there choices that that you think have been the right choices to make or the wrong choices to make? Like, I'm just kind of curious how you approach this, and if there are any examples that help you articulate this.
So I think Andrew covered a lot of what I think is the most important stuff. So decentralization and making stuff as simple and understandable as possible. And one of the difficulties in that is just that because Bitcoin, we like to do soft forks and we don't like to change things too much, kind of in order to keep it understandable. There's this whole backlog of complexity that you either have to keep to just keep things the same so that you're not making changes underneath everybody, but like you've got this sig hash single stuff, you've got how code separator works. It's all this weird complexity that some people understand, but very few, and the people who do understand it hate it and want it to go away. And trying to kind of combine those two goals is pretty difficult. And as far as all the other chains and stuff go, that gets into the economic stuff. So like at the moment with Ethereum, or at least a couple of days ago maybe it's been resolved now, there's been a whole discussion about whether all the people doing the MEV, minor extractable value stuff, should be saying, hey, we've discovered a better way that we could have done if we hadn't committed these blocks a few minutes ago. Let's just reorg the blocks out, get more value from that we could have gotten from arbitrage or whatever. And who cares if we're doing more reorgs and that's kind of destabilizing the chain? It gets more profit immediately for us. And I think that goes back to one of the concerns I've seen from other people raising, which is that you want Bitcoin to be the most valuable thing on the Bitcoin chain. You don't want other assets like the US dollar or Tether or whatever to be what's driving people mining Bitcoin and what's driving the security of it. You want that to be Bitcoin, so that at least the incentives are kind of aligned, so that everyone working on the Bitcoin chain wants the Bitcoin value to rise. There's not a whole lot of working at cross purposes. And so I guess in summary, to add to what Andrew thinks about, I'd say trying to clean up as much of what's possible in historical code that we can, and just trying to keep incentives aligned so that we don't encourage people to work against what Bitcoin's trying to do.
Yeah, I think well said. Cory, do you want to add in to that anything about, how you think about security in Bitcoin?
No, I think that was pretty well said. I do want to add though that to Andrew's point about complexity. So a few years we forked in a new feature to Bitcoin called segregated witness or SegWit. And one of the biggest hurdles that we had with so this was an upgrade. This was kind of a response to the block size debate that went on for years and years. But one of the biggest problems that we had was convincing people that it was okay, convincing people that it was safe, because there were constant memes generated saying this makes Bitcoin insecure, or you're not signing your transaction or your whole transaction, or you're missing some data, or just all of these kind of untruths. But they're really hard to dispel just because of how complicated this stuff is. So there is this kind of tension between sometimes we really do want to simplify, but also in order to simplify, you have to complexify first.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly challenging. All right, we only have a few minutes left, but I really wanted to get this question in, which is things that you are scared of that haven't happened yet. So what is something that really worries you that might happen? I think it's really important to get to this question, because I think it's important that people sort of learn about the state that Bitcoin's in and what might or might not happen. I believe in sharing information. So let's kind of try to do this rapid fire, if that's okay. Okay, so let's do this quickly, and then we'll wrap up. Andrew, go ahead.
Sure. So right now in Bitcoin, miners produce blocks. The majority of the money that they're paid for producing these blocks comes from what's called the block subsidy. It's just like a free 6.25 Bitcoin that they receive every single block. They receive that 6.25, and then in addition to that, they receive network fees, which right now account for maybe a quarter of the total reward that they receive for every block. The subsidy goes down by half every 4 years, meaning it becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, and the value of the network historically has gone up every year, meaning that the value of the fees goes higher and higher and higher. And so what's going to happen soon is that there will be sort of a phase shift where the majority of miner rewards actually come from transaction fees rather than this free subsidy. And what that means is that miners, rather than being rewarded just for being on the right chain, they'll be rewarded for being on the right chain and for the set of transactions that they're including in their block. And that may mean in some cases that they want to go back a block and kind of steal transactions from the previous block or something like that. So basically what we'll have is an economic phase shift. And that's something that hasn't happened in the history of the network. And it scares me because I'm not an economist. I don't know how to think about that. I don't know. It's just, whoops.
All right. AJ, what's yours?
I guess the thing I'm most scared of is people joining Bitcoin as developers and waiting a while, establishing a reputation, and then trying to deliberately insert bugs.
That's a good one. I'm also worried about that. There might be some of those in our midst already, sleeper agents. Cory, what about you?
I think my biggest fear is one of the technical ones. So either like an inflation bug that comes through or a chain split bug. But my thinking has changed over the years, because I think one possible outcome is that something like that happens and there's not all that much of a reaction, meaning that the price doesn't tank or the universe doesn't end, which it should. So if something like that were to happen and there weren't some major public outcry, then what would the value of the thing be? And we have seen that in other cryptocurrencies, where you actually amplify and increase the value of the things, because now it's just free publicity. So I'm afraid of if there is a major bug or a major attack, it may not actually do what it should.
Yeah, if we had many more hours, we could talk about, what might happen in the event of various attacks and how to fix them. Mine is that there's some gnarly bug in the peer-to-peer network that just, I don't know, isolates nodes and causes a network split, just because the peer-to-peer network is something I find very difficult to understand and model in my head. Okay, let's close. So we only have a couple minutes left, but what is the long-term project that you would want to see to improve Bitcoin security over the next 10 years? And keep in mind, there are people watching this who might be able to help make some of that happen. So Cory, I'll start with you.
I think Andrew kind of hinted at what I would like to do earlier when he described it as legibility. So Bitcoin is not all that legible, and one of the toughest things is that people are reading and writing by hand. So I would love to see lots more auto-generated stuff that can be analyzed in much deeper ways than what we have now.
AJ, how about you?
I'd like to see, we've got a bunch of people working on developing Bitcoin. I'd like to see a bunch of people dedicated to testing Bitcoin.
I think that's a good one. Andrew?
Yeah, related to what Cory said, I'd like to see a project to try to get all the consensus code somehow in a form that it can be reasoned about and analyzed automatically, something that is legible to mathematicians instead of being, legible to almost nobody, right?
Yeah.
And in general, making the way the rules of the system amenable to making strong statements that it's not going to blow up unexpectedly. And
yeah, more reliability for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would love to see some longer term thinking in that realm about, whether it's programming languages or it's incentives or it's formalizations, what can we do to really to think about how to long term, are there ideas we can apply to make things more secure for everyone, and processes that we can put in place to do that too. Well, we've reached the end of our time. I want to thank the panelists and thank you all in the audience for joining us today. If you are watching this, hopefully you've learned a little bit more about Bitcoin as a system and its technology and some of the risks, but some of the interesting problems as well. We hope that you enjoy the rest of this conference. And if you want to get involved in helping support Bitcoin development, there will be many other panels and ways that you can reach out to do that as well. So thank you all for being here.